Here I'm talking about the Renaissance painting beginning in 1400, and we're looking at Santa Maria Novella, which is one of the Italian Gothic churches in Florence. It's near the train station. I'm going to be focusing on this painting on the wall right here. It's fresco by Masaccio. It's called the Trinity fresco. This is what it looked like. I wanted you to see what it looks like in the church, so you can see the context. When you just see this, it's hard to tell. It's a very large picture, but in the context of the church, it's rather small. This is the first, or the earliest version of a painting that is done with one-point perspective, the Brunelleschian invention I talked about last time. We don't have the panels that Brunelleschi used to demonstrate perspective, and if there were any earlier pictures, we don't have them. I believe Masaccio was a friend of Brunelleschi, and in addition to the Brunelleschian perspective that he used in this picture, he also used or depicts Brunelleschian architecture. What you see here is a tall vertical rectangle. There's a painting. This area right here is above what appears to be a tomb. Tombs in the walls is a common thing in churches, and the patron, depicted here with his wife on this side, is entombed, or supposed to be entombed in the wall right here. And instead of having a large marble tomb sitting against the wall or embedded into the wall, he has a fictive image frescoed into the wall with a inscription and an image of a skeleton on a sarcophagus. Though all of this is painted, there is a fictive image, I guess, of a platform, some sort of an altar table here being held up by little colonnettes. Above are steps leading back fictively into space, and you're looking up into a chapel that goes back into the church wall. If you notice the architecture of this church, it's Gothic. It's pointed arches. It has a very loud black and white, or probably green and white marble pattern along the edges of all of the arches and vaultings. So it has a style of its own, and it's very different from what you see here in the picture. The picture is of what Masaccio would have called modern architecture, or thought of as modern architecture, because this sort of thing, entablature with pilasters, arches, is the architecture that Brunelleschi had, reinvented, and what we think of as the Renaissance, or the early Renaissance version of antique architecture. It's nothing like the church, is the point. But if you were standing in the church at a precise point, there would be, I guess, when this was new, a kind of an illusion where if you stood, if you were to stand in front of this painting, the vanishing point is about where my cursor is, and that means all of the lines that move away from you in space, these in particular, would meet right here. The tabletop meets a little, has some orthogonals going back into space, meeting around here. And if you were to stand with your eye level here, which is about where it would be, if you look here where these people are standing, this person here's eye level is about, so around there. So when you're standing there, you're supposed to look up and see as if you're looking into a chapel going back into the wall. Now, the illusion is not very strong, and that's one of the points I want to make about the use that Italian artists made of the invention of perspective. Perspective works in such a way that it organizes a picture so that everything in the picture is seen from one single point of view. That point of view would be where your eyes are, and from there, if you imagine standing in front of this, and there is a chapel actually going into the wall, if you were to draw a line in space all the way back to, say, this wall here, or this one back here, or this one back here, at any point, they are at a certain distance from your eye. in a measured distance, and the amount of recession, how small this gets, should be the same degree of recession and diminution that you would have if you were actually looking at the thing at that distance. It's a kind of surface geometry where you take a rectangle like this one and you divide it into shapes. The way composition was done earlier than this, before they had one-point perspective, they weren't interested particularly in showing everything from the same point of view. That wasn't part of their toolkit. But they did organize space, or at least they organized pictures according to some geometric scheme. Like, for example, this is a rectangle. It happens to be a golden rectangle, and the whole thing from the bottom floor to the top is a root 5 rectangle, if you're familiar with those sorts of things. And they have an implied geometry within them. And if you were to draw such a rectangle on a piece of paper and divide it up into its component sub-rectangles and sub-shapes, then you get a sort of a spider-webby kind of clothesline upon which you can put figures and other elements of a composition. And it all has to do with how do you put things in a picture so that it's organized, so that things are in the right place. Well, given that's what's called constructive geometry, given constructive geometry and adding to it a particular instance of constructive geometry called linear perspective, then you can organize the space and organize the surface pattern into certain ways that you get a composed picture, or a picture that is composed, kind of an intellectual kind of composition rather than an intuitive one. If you think of the way pictures were composed in the North, it's done by eye. That is, you just put them where you want to, where it looks right. Here, it's more of a where you know it ought to be kind of thing. If you look at these figures, for example, they make a kind of a pyramid here, or a triangle on the surface. And there's several triangles, whether you use these heads as the points, or if you use these hands and feet. This is an inverted triangle here. This circle that represents the arch. If you continue it around, it has a coincidence of edge, I guess you would call it, right here, and several other things align, like the tops of the the abacus of the capitals align with different things. It's very symmetrical. Same things on the left and right. It's designed according to a system, and linear perspective was a new system to Masaccio and to everyone else, and he was using it in such a way so as to organize the pieces of the composition into this rectangle. One of the things you do, or the results of a kind of composition like this, is that the illusion of the space that you could get with one-point perspective is diminished. That is, if you wanted to draw a picture on the wall in such a way that it looks as though there actually were a recessed area behind the wall, and that you're looking through the wall and you don't see the surface at all, then linear perspective would be the tool to use. But you would have to do it in such a way so that nothing interfered with that illusion. And the person who saw the picture would have to stand at a precise place, and you could look at it and see, yes, there's illusion. I kind of can picture something through the wall there, and I can't see the surface. Okay, that's called to fool the eye, or trompe l'oeil is the term for that. And it's been done in later pictures from this. There are places in Italy where you can look up at frescoes on the ceiling, for example, where there's fictive architecture up there and there's real architecture up there, and you can't easily tell which is which. That's called fooling the eye. And this is not what Masaccio was doing. It's kind of an intellectual version of pretending to fool the eye, but he's done everything he can to limit the amount of illusion there would be so that you see the surface. Because all design, all composition occurs on the surface, and any illusion of space kind of diminishes that what you see as the composition. So when you see this, it looks very rigidly composed. I mean, the width of the picture is right at the width of the entablature. Everything, all these elements are very strongly related to the format. There's divisions within the format, and there's subdivisions all over the place, and all these subdivisions relate proportionally to the whole. So as a first instance of linear perspective, this is interesting in that it does have the elements of illusion that one would expect from this tool. It also has lots of consciously composed elements that many works in the Italian Renaissance that we're going to see don't appear to be as rigorously composed or as obviously composed as this one. One of the side effects of a tool of linear perspective is that if it's done right, you can sort of reverse engineer it. You can look at the information contained within the data of how much the recession recedes and where the vanishing point is. There's also all sorts of evidence on the surface where Masaccio put a string, or let me go back here, like put a nail in the wall here and had a string pulled taut to a point over here and snap the string so that within the wet plaster you can see the string has been embedded to tell him where these lines are going to be. I mean, when you use a system like that, with such tools, you get the evidence, and you can recreate. This is an elevation of the side view, and this is an elevation of the front of just what the perspective scheme is telling you the space is. So, if we were to extrapolate out from that information, you would get this is the eye of a person standing there, looking at the picture. This would be the surface of the wall. In front of the wall is where the donors are kneeling, and in front of that is where the tomb, the fictive tomb, is with its altar table and its colonnades, and a little skeleton right there. And back into the wall, you see this is where John and Mary are standing, and there's Christ on the cross and God the Father behind that, and then behind that is all the space of the chapel. And this little apsidial area right here, this would be where the coffers are in the ceiling. Looking at all that, picturing all that, and going back to the picture, okay, yeah, I can kind of see that, though it looks much flatter than it did in that extrapolated elevation view. I mean, now, this doesn't seem nearly as far away as it ought to be according to that scheme, but that's the information that's within these lines of perspective tell you that it's there, even though you don't see it. And the reason you don't see it is because Masaccio went to a lot of trouble so that you wouldn't see it, so that it would look as though the back wall is really immediately behind God the Father. It's God the Father here holding up the cross, and that they seem to be, or read, as if they were on the same plane as this arch is, and that Mary and John seem to also be in that same plane, and the donors, if they're in front, they're not very far in front. So one of the things that the perspective is doing here is flattening it out, as opposed to giving a strong illusion. Though the illusion, or at least the idea of it, exists within it, but it's not strong. And give you a view of it's a really old photograph. You can see where it is in relation to the wall. The wall is an enormous thing. You can imagine standing here and not really getting much of an illusion. One thing, because of the way I'm painting these things I'm describing, but also it's a vastly different style of architecture than what you have going on here. It's much more like Brunelleschi's architecture, the stuff that was going outside the church, elsewhere in Florence. These sorts of things were being built that we saw last time. Masaccio, we have another thing that we're going to show, another two works that Masaccio is responsible for. This is another church in Florence. It's across the river. It's in the Church of the Carmelites, and this is the Brancacci Chapel. It has works that were done later, like, for example, this looks Baroque up here, and this is a chapel of a big church. Inside this chapel, you have the three walls with lots of frescoes on them, and we're going to be concentrating on the ones up above your head. The ones, this long one here is called the tribute money, and this very tall, skinny one here, which is the expulsion from the Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve. Okay, so I want you to note the position of the light, that is the window in the chapel, and how it shines light onto the people in the fictive fresco. I also want to point out that it's been cleaned recently, within the last couple of decades. This is the way it looked when I first took art history. It was very dingy, and it had fig leaves to cover up the nudity of the figures. But once it was cleaned, and they took these off because they were added afterwards. In fact, years afterwards, in a way to cover up the nudity. But originally, this is the way it was painted. The colors are brighter. The figures are not covered. And as you look back real quick, this is the position in space. So it's way above your head when you're looking at it. The figures of Adam and Eve are rendered as if they were solid three-dimensional figures in space. They cast shadows. Notice the position of the cast shadows, and going back, the relationship of this window to the figures and their cast shadows, so as to make them look as real as possible within the context of frescoes, which are not particularly realistic. You don't have the opportunity, as you would in a panel painting, and certainly not in an oil painting, to make all the details that they would have in the north. But you can render light and dark and modeled figures. Now, the figures that he chose are classical base figures. The one on the left is there was a sculpture that was available to him to see. It was called the Belvedere torso. It's just a fragment of I believe it's a Hellenistic sculpture or a Roman sculpture of the torso, of a male torso with this bit without the arms and legs or even the head, but the mass of the torso is still remaining, and when you see it lit with light and dark and light and shadow on it, it looks very much like this figure. And the Eve is also from a Roman or late Greek Eve, the kind that the modest one, where she's covering herself. So notice that there's classical reference here. There's also unusually in Italian art, expressiveness. The figures are expressing shame, using this sort of theatrical gesture of putting your hands over your face, and then Eve covering herself, and you can see on the expression of her face she's very, very much ashamed and experiencing despair. So that's kind of an unusual thing. Most of the Italian pictures are emotion free, or very limited in their emotion. This looks like something that kind of goes back to Giotto. Giotto would have this sort of expressiveness in his, and Masaccio is kind of like the new Masaccio. It's as if it started over again after a century. The representation of the angel who's expelling Adam and Eve from their garden is a wonderful example of foreshortening. We see her, or it, from underneath, lit, still from that same window over to the right, and is foreshortened. We see the angel from this angle that you expect to see it if it's in this position in space, which is not the normal position you see things from. You're seeing it from way below. But the figures of Adam and Eve, you're seeing them as if you're looking straight on them. And again, to point out that you're not actually looking straight on them, you're looking from way below. But there's a phenomenon that occurs when you look at pictures on the wall that are way up high. That when you look at them, you sort of mentally put yourself on a level to look straight at them. You can't look straight at them because there's no way, unless you had scaffolding, to see them straight on. But people don't tend to have a problem with that. And when we look at the next picture, there's another similar sort of point that I want to make with that. Before we get there, I just want to mention that Ghiberti, this is one of the panels from Ghiberti's Gates of Paradise. And if you look here, the angel and the relationship of the angel and Adam and Eve, very similar to Masaccio, coming through this sort of I guess you would call it a theatrical prop, indicating the doorway into paradise, similar to what Masaccio had done. So you can see that this had been influential to Ghiberti. There's another image of what it looks like on the wall, and here's an image of close up. You can see these lines very clearly. They are the sutures that separate each day's work within a fresco. Frescoes are done very quickly. They plaster up an area. This is what they believe to be they can work in a day, and called a giornata. A giornata are it's what's called a day's work. If you see, let's go back to this, you can see the different sutures and the technology of making the sutures invisible and making the colors exactly between them so as to not show the difference was not as good as it was going to be later, where you don't see the sutures at all and all the colors actually blend to each other so that there's no lines. This is an early version where apparently whatever Masaccio used for this blue wasn't mixed exactly the same as the blue is the rest of it. That's why it looks a little different here. Let's look at the tribute money, which is immediately to the right. We look a wider view. This is Eve, and so to the right is another panel, and it has a fictive architecture here, architectural frame. This is an actual reentrant corner of the wall, and there's a fictive pilaster or some sort of architectural thing to frame this picture. That's to make it look as though the wall were not there and we're looking through a window, and that this is some architecture holding up an entablature which gives us the window that we're looking through. Of course, the window that we're looking through is way up high on the wall, and as such, this one up here, we are not able to see this straight on. So if there actually were a window there and people were actually in that fictive space back there, you wouldn't be able to see them properly from this angle. So the perspective, that is, having a picture where theoretically you're supposed to see it from an eye level at the vanishing point, as the Trinity fresco was rendered in, could not work in this, even theoretically, couldn't work in this space. But it works all the same. When you look at this from the floor looking up, you don't have any problem at all imagining what it would look like from a height at its eye level. Now, this image is similar to what kind of thing that you would have in Giotto. It's just a more modern version of it. Giotto did have figures of the disciples and Christ, similar to the way he's got these rendered as a big group of people, though you can see them all. It's not just a pile of heads in the back, but you can see them all, and you can see pretty much how they all are arranged in space more clearly than, say, Giotto would. There's a figure in front looking back at them, so as to give a spatial relation. But even so, these figures make a rectangle very solidly within the rectangle of the whole. The story here is a tax collector has asked Christ if he was going to pay his taxes, and Christ asked Peter, who's over here. So if I can zoom out a little bit, you can see the whole thing there. Peter is gone to get the fish, and out of the fish's mouth comes the money, and then Peter over here pays the money. But there's three different scenes. This would be the first one, this would be the second one, and this would be the third one, depicted as if they were all in one space. the one continuous space includes landscapes with distant mountains, which are the sort of mountains you would see from Florence, looking out at the mountain range, the Tuscan mountains. There's a lake over here, and there's some architecture, which is a simplified version of kind of classical architecture with round arches. Look real quick at the perspective scheme. Perspective has a horizon line, which is implied here because you don't actually, it's not expressed anywhere. You assume that this is where the horizon line would be, because this is where the orthogonals meet. Orthogonals are these lines that go away from you in space, that are perpendicular to you. And they all come to a point, all these steps here, they all come to a point right here. If you look at the picture, they are on Christ's face. Now, if you look at your book, and many books say that the vanishing point is behind Christ's head. There are other paintings like this where the vanishing point occurs at the same place as some other significant part of the picture, and they have a way of pointing to that part of the picture, and they are pointing actually across the surface of the picture. They're not going back into space, and that there's not anything behind Christ's head. Christ's head is paint on a surface, and these lines are implied as being on the surface, and it is a geometrical scheme that makes this happen. And so it is a way to point at something across the surface. It is very similar to what Giotto was doing in a similar composition, that is the one we saw before of the Kiss of Judas, where behind or above Christ's head, there's a crowd of people, and there's a bunch of lines that are pointing at Christ, and those lines are the staffs, the pikes, lances, whatever, of the Roman soldiers, but they are situated in such a way that they point, and there's other elements that point at Christ as well. In this case, Masaccio is using something a little less artificial, or at least apparently artificial, of this building, which he doesn't need to have a building here, but he has a building just so to have something to use this perspective scheme to point at Christ's face as a way of picking him out as being different, as being a more significant thing. Looking at the whole thing is not as obvious, but you're aware when your eyes are fixed here that there's a line, a very strong line right here pointing at it, and that this line here is also pointing at it. And if you continue looking, you'll say, oh, these are also doing it, and also the mountains are doing it, and these trees are also doing it. So I just wanted to point out these compositional things that are not spatially related, but related as things that go across the composition. Note again the shadows. The shadows are cast as if the light in the window, which will be on this wall over to the right, are shining light on the figures. Okay, the next artist is named Paolo Uccello. Uccello means bird. And this first work that I'm showing is it's a geometrical drawing of a chalice. It looks for all the world as if it were drawn by a computer, what we call it, the wireframe of a 3D model. It's not exactly the same kind in the sense that the way 3D software today draws images like this wireframe is that they're able to take advantage of Cartesian space. That is, when you have a graph, an x-y axis, and you can measure any point on that graph by saying it's x1, 2, 3, 4, or negative x1, whatever, so as to plot using the x and the y axis any point on that surface. You can add another axis that goes back into space, the z-axis, and that one, with that information, you can plot any point in space, in three-dimensional space, and that the computer software can take into account points in space like this. This invention is occurred later, of plotting things in space using actual three-dimensional data or spatial data with these axes. This is done in a different way. In fact, when you think of Brunelleschian linear perspective, it's a different way from that. I've I've studied this picture, and it's a grand example of somebody just who was obsessed with this scheme. There's nothing hardly at all like this before this drawing was made, and even after this drawing made, very few people did anything like this because it was very hard to do. And it's the artist has plotted all the points on the surface of the paper, using geometrical schemes. It's too difficult to go into, but they're incised into this paper are a countless lines radiating in all different directions, which are used to plot where these points are, and straight lines are drawn from point to point. This is something that the system can do. It can create a strong illusion and show you exactly how far away something is from your eye when you look at it. Now, this artist, Paolo Uccello, we have one example of his painting. And in his paintings, he would use this scheme. The painting we're using as an example is not one where that had that much examples or opportunity to do perspective, but he managed to get some in anyway. This is the Battle of San Romano, which was an event that occurred in Florence. Before this, one of those times when Florence was at war with someone. I think it was the Sienese this time, and the condottiere, the general, this guy here, asked for this painting to be made to show how he did this battle. And Uccello has depicted them in a very artificial sort of universe. I'll look close up in a minute, but there are lots of odd things about this picture. One is that it has different levels of details for different things. When you look at the horse, let me just zoom in. Well, look at the horse. It has very broad areas of no detail at all, just flat color, just an indication of a shallow color and a highlight color and nothing in between. Similar to the other horses are also depicted that way, almost as if it weren't finished. Whereas armor, has all the detail that he could get into such a picture. And it also looks as though he's looked at actual armor and shown exactly how that armor looks with all its detail and particular shapes, is because he wanted to be historically accurate. I imagine that the patron asked him to paint, to get all this stuff in that he was most interested in, is the mail. It looks like he's drawn every little link of mail and every little bit doodad that's on the horses and on the the special hat that he's wearing. It's because he wanted it to be accurate. And the face, I imagine that this is an accurate representation of the face of the general of the battle. He also has a lot of detail in things like this background image of a hedge with flowers in it, which I assume is some sort of historical accurate thing. And then there's a landscape in the background. You can zoom out a little, you can see it. Little figures in the back. There's a man with a crossbow. He looks like he's arming a crossbow, and there's some horses and knights on horseback with lances, and a few little figures in the background doing various things. There's a large banner. There's a large banner here that's flowing in the breeze in an elaborate manner. Though you have two different levels of space. You have the level of the background, which is all relatively flat, and then the level of the foreground, with the horses and the hedge between the two. It has some interesting, compositional elements. These lances going in at diagonal things, sort of to give a rhythm. They get smaller over here. Let me zoom out a couple of more times. You can see the whole picture. You can see the rhythm that is developed over here to show the motion to the right that is happening with this general and his knights. An odd thing occurs. You notice that on the floor, which seems to be a white floor, as if the whole thing is occurring on a stage. The broken lances and the pieces of armor and even this fallen warrior here, all seem to be aligning to a grid, as if it were on a grid on the floor. Of not all of them, you can see that some are a little bit diagonal, but they do seem to have a preponderance of things going back into space, as if there's a implied grid on the floor and everything falls according to this grid. And having a grid on the floor is one of those things that perspectivists, that is the artists who are interested in doing perspective, wanted to have as the ideal. If you're going to have a scene, you start out with a gridded floor so that everything can be sort of measured back in space. But when you're dealing with nature and you're lots of men on horseback and battles and broken lances and things, that's not really a thing that you can have measure things back in space. But since this artist was interested in that, he sort of artificially made that happen. Interesting thing to look at. It's kind of unusual in the whole of the Renaissance. Uccello was an unusual one of them. This is a period of time, that is the 1400s. There seemed to be an unusually large number of very creative artists who were, I guess the atmosphere was such that they were all competing against one another in such a way that they, when one made some sort of innovation, another would take that innovation, add to it, and put his own innovation with it, so that you see a kind of progress throughout the century, moving from the Masaccio type, where it's relatively simple, just bold, volumetric figures with light and dark, until you get things that are more sophisticated, more detailed, more individual. Each artist has their own look that they're going for. Some add more emotion, some add more decorative aspects, some put some elements of their particular region, if they're from a different part around Tuscany, something particular to them. As you go through the century, there's a progress towards realism, towards naturalism, and towards a kind of an idealism, until you get to the High Renaissance, and we'll see more of those. But we have a few of these middle guys to see before we get to that.